It started subtly. Small, almost unnoticeable things that you wouldn't think twice about. Footsteps overhead, late at night, when I knew my neighbors above were sound asleep. A fleeting shadow, darting past the attic door, seen only in the corner of my eye, like a ghost passing by. I dismissed it at first, chalking it up to the stress of the move, to a new city, a new home. I told myself I was just overthinking it. But the incidents persisted. Every night it was the same, the soft, scratching sound in the attic, like claws scraping against wood, and every night it got worse. At first I thought maybe there were raccoons or squirrels up there, some pest that had made its home in my attic. I even considered calling someone to check, but every time I climbed up to investigate, the attic was empty. Then came the feeling of being watched. At first, it was subtle, like a chill that would run up my spine while I sat in the living room, the sense that someone was standing just out of sight, watching me from the shadows. But over time, that feeling grew into something darker, more oppressive, until I couldn't shake it. Even during the day, I could feel it, like a pair of unseen eyes following my every move, never letting me forget they were there. One night, the footsteps overhead were louder than usual, more deliberate, like something was pacing above me. A soft thumping followed, as though something heavy was being dragged across the attic floor, scraping against the beams. My heart began to race, a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Grabbing a flashlight, I made my way to the attic door. My hands trembled as I reached for the handle, dread coiling tight in my gut. The door creaked open, the smell of stale, musty air hitting me immediately. I hesitated. Everything inside me screamed to turn back, to close the door and pretend none of this was happening. But I couldn't. I had to know. The attic was as I remembered it. Dust-covered boxes, old furniture, forgotten remnants of the previous owner's life. I swept the beam of my flashlight across the room, taking in every detail. But something caught my eye, a faint glint in the far corner. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. A pair of eyes. My heart slammed in my chest. I stopped breathing. The eyes blinked. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray cat, but deep down, I knew. There was something else up here with me. My legs felt heavy as I stepped forward, the creaking floorboards betraying my every movement. Slowly, the figure came into view, crouched in the far corner, half hidden beneath a pile of old blankets. It was no animal. It was a man. His eyes gleamed in the light of my flashlight, narrowed and filled with something I couldn't quite place, something feral. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just stared at me with those eyes, unblinking, his gaze boring into me like he could see right through to my soul. My mouth went dry, and my voice failed me. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but the words wouldn't come. The figure stirred, rising to his feet slowly, deliberately, as though savoring my fear. The man's appearance came into focus under the flickering light. His clothes were ragged, hanging loosely off his gaunt frame. His face was hidden beneath a thick, unkempt beard, his hair matted and wild. But it was his eyes that truly terrified me, glassy and distant, yet sharp with a strange kind of madness. "Who are you?" I finally croaked, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer. Instead, he took a step toward me, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight. My heart hammered in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I was frozen in place, rooted to the spot by the sheer terror coursing through me. I fumbled for the light switch on the wall, my fingers shaking uncontrollably. When I finally found it, the single bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered to life, casting the attic in a sickly yellow glow. The man stopped moving. For a long, agonizing moment, we just stared at each other. His eyes, once filled with malice, now seemed distant, almost sad. I opened my mouth to speak again, but before I could, he turned and slunk back into the shadows, disappearing behind a stack of boxes. I stood there, paralyzed, my mind racing. I had to call the police, get help. Anything to get this man out of my home. But something about the way he vanished, the silence that followed, made me hesitate. It was like he wasn't really there, like he had never been there at all. But that wasn't possible. I finally managed to tear myself away from the attic, slamming the door shut behind me, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I bolted it for good measure, but even then I knew it wouldn't stop him. Whatever he was, wherever he had come from, he was still in my house. That night I couldn't sleep. Every sound, every creak in the walls sent a jolt of panic through me. I kept expecting to hear those footsteps again, that soft, dragging sound. But the house was silent. Too silent. The next morning I decided I couldn't stay here any longer. I packed my bags, called a friend, and made plans to leave the city entirely. But as I walked out the front door, I caught a glimpse of the attic window from the corner of my eye. The man was there, watching me. His eyes, gleaming in the early morning light, followed me as I walked down the street. He never left. The first sign was the feeling, the unsettling sensation that someone was watching me. It began subtly, a prickling at the back of my neck as I moved about my apartment, a fleeting shadow in my peripheral vision that vanished when I turned to face it. I dismissed it as stress, the pressures of city life playing tricks on my mind. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger and more intrusive with each passing day. It started with little things, curtains twitching in the building across the street, glints of light on window panes at odd hours. My paranoia festered, fueled by the knowledge that I was alone, vulnerable in my own home. I felt like a character in a thriller novel, trapped in a story that was becoming all too real. One night, as I prepared for bed, I caught a glimpse of movement through the window across the alley. A figure, silhouetted against the dim light of an apartment, was watching me. My heart pounded, fear clutching at my throat. I stared back, unable to tear my gaze from the shadowy figure. It remained there, unmoving, for what felt like an eternity, its intensity sending chills down my spine. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, melting back into the shadows, leaving me trembling in the silence of my apartment. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew the truth. Someone was watching me. I began taking precautions, drawing the curtains tight, double-checking the locks on my doors and windows. I even set up a few old security cameras I'd had lying around, hoping to catch a glimpse of my unseen stalker. But it wasn't enough. The feeling of being watched persisted, a constant presence that followed me from room to room, a shadow lurking at the edge of my vision. One evening, as I sat in my living room trying to lose myself in a book, I noticed it again, the glint of light on a window pane across the alley. This time I was determined to see who was watching me. I grabbed my binoculars, my hands trembling with a mixture of fear and anticipation, and raised them to my eyes. As I focused on the window, my breath caught in my throat. The figure was back, its face illuminated by the eerie glow of a computer screen. It was a man, his features obscured by distance and poor lighting, but I could see enough. He was smiling, a slow, predatory grin that sent shivers down my spine. I watched in horror as he reached up and slowly drew back the hood he had been wearing, revealing his face. It was my neighbor, the friendly man who lived across the alley, the one I had always exchanged polite smiles with in the hallway. The realization hit me like a punch in the gut. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I tried to process what I had just seen. How long had he been watching me? Why was he doing this? The questions swirled in my mind, but I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer safe in my own home. For the next few days, I became a prisoner in my apartment. I avoided the windows, fearing that if I looked out again, I might see him lurking there. I stopped answering my phone, ignored messages from friends, and convinced myself that every creak of the floorboards was him making his way toward me. I lived in a constant state of heightened anxiety, every shadow in my apartment morphing into a possible threat. On the fourth night, Desperation got the better of me. I couldn't take the isolation any longer. I decided to confront him, to demand an explanation for his actions. Armed with my phone, a flashlight, and an unhealthy dose of courage, I crept down the stairs to his door. I hesitated before knocking, my heart racing with anticipation. What if he was armed? What if he decided I was the intruder? But the idea of him watching me, knowing I was afraid, drove me to knock. A moment of silence passed, and then I heard shuffling on the other side. "Who is it?" he called, his voice laced with feigned innocence. "It's me. I saw you. I know you've been watching me." My voice trembled, but I tried to sound resolute. A chuckle escaped him, deep and chilling. "I was just admiring the view," he replied, the door creaking open just a crack. I could barely make out his face in the dim light, a sickly smile spreading across his lips. "You've always been so entertaining." Before I could respond, the door swung wide open. He stood before me, the light behind him casting a grotesque shadow that stretched unnaturally across the hallway. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot, fear paralyzing my legs. "Come in, let's talk," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "No, stay away from me," I shouted, stepping back. Suddenly, his expression shifted, the playful demeanor vanishing. He took a step forward, eyes narrowing, and I turned on my heel, sprinting back to my apartment. I could hear his footsteps behind me, gaining ground, my heart pounding in my ears. I burst through my front door, slamming it shut and locking it before stumbling backward, breathless. The sound of his laughter echoed from the other side of the door, an unsettling reminder that he was still out there, waiting. I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands, praying they would arrive in time. But as I waited, a sense of dread washed over me. What if he was already in the building, waiting for me to let my guard down? I glanced toward the window, half expecting to see him grinning back at me. Instead, I was met with darkness, a darkness that felt alive, whispering promises of fear and dread. Hours passed. The police finally arrived, their presence a temporary shield against the nightmare lurking just outside. They searched the building but found nothing. I could tell by their faces that they didn't believe me. "It was probably just a misunderstanding," one officer said, trying to reassure me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. As they left, I felt the familiar prickling sensation return, the feeling of being watched clawing at my sanity. I drew the curtains tight, but the shadows outside felt closer than ever. I spent the next few weeks living in a haze of paranoia. I became hyper-aware of every sound, every flicker of movement outside. It wasn't just my neighbor anymore. It was the entire world outside my apartment, every passing car, every pedestrian, every shadow. Then one night, I received a package. It was unmarked, simply placed at my doorstep. I opened it, my hands trembling, revealing a small, twisted figure resembling me, eyes painted wide open, a sinister smile carved into the wood. It felt like a warning, a message from the man across the alley. I backed away, panic surging through me as I realized the truth. He wasn't just watching me. He was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I could feel him out there, lurking, his eyes fixated on me, ready to turn my world upside down. That night I lay in bed, every creak of the floorboards sounding like footsteps in the darkness. I kept the lights on, convinced that if I could see him, I could defend myself. But as the hours dragged on, I fell into a restless sleep, my mind racing with dread. When I awoke, the sun had just begun to rise, illuminating my apartment with a soft glow. But something felt wrong. My heart sank as I noticed the curtains were drawn open, the morning light streaming in uninvited. I hadn't opened them. I rushed to the window, heart racing, peering into the alley. He was gone. But that's when I noticed something else. His window was wide open, the computer screen flickering to life in the dimness of the room. I stepped back, feeling sick. The realization settled in, heavier than lead. He wasn't just watching me. He had invited me into his world, and now the game had changed. I was no longer the observer. I was the prey. The feeling of being watched was no longer a distant fear. It was a reality I couldn't escape. And somewhere in that darkened apartment, my neighbor was waiting, a predatory smile lurking just behind the glow of the screen, ready to claim what he believed was his. I knew then that the only way out was to confront him, but the question remained. Would I be strong enough to face my watcher, or would I succumb to the darkness that threatened to swallow me whole? When I first moved into the quiet suburb of Maplewood, I was seeking refuge from the chaos of my past life. The streets were lined with quaint houses, their yards well kept, a stark contrast to the turmoil I had left behind. Among them lived Mr. Smith, my neighbor, who epitomized the ideal neighborly persona. He was quiet and polite, always offering a friendly wave and a warm smile. His presence was a comforting constant, an anchor in the unfamiliar waters of my new existence. Mr. Smith introduced himself shortly after I arrived, his demeanor disarming, his voice soothing like a lullaby. He kept to himself, his life a monotonous rhythm of routine that made me feel oddly secure. Every morning he left for work at the same time, returning promptly at 6, weekends spent gardening or tinkering in his garage. His consistency stood in stark contrast to my chaotic schedule as I navigated a new job and the creeping loneliness of a new city. As the weeks passed, Mr. Smith became a small beacon of light in my otherwise solitary life. Our chats over the fence were lifelines, his small acts of kindness weaving a thread of connection that I desperately needed. He listened to my stories with genuine interest, offering advice that, though simple, helped me feel less isolated. I began to look forward to our interactions, his familiar face providing comfort in the anonymity of the city. One crisp autumn evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows danced across our yards, Mr. Smith invited me over for dinner. The invitation took me by surprise, a welcome distraction from my solitary evenings. For a fleeting moment, unease flickered within me. Despite his friendly demeanor, there was something about Mr. Smith, a guarded look in his eyes, an air of reserve, that made me hesitate. I brushed it aside, attributing it to my own anxieties, and accepted. As I stepped into his home, I was struck by its sterile, almost clinical orderliness. The living room was immaculate, everything arranged as if for a magazine shoot. It was beautiful but lacked the warmth of a lived-in space. The air was thick with the scent of furniture polish and something faintly metallic, a combination that made my skin prickle. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air outside. We sat down to eat, the silence suffocating, the only sound the clinking of our silverware against the china. I could feel the tension building between us, palpable and unnerving. Mr. Smith's hands trembled as he lifted his fork, his usually calm demeanor replaced by an anxious energy. He kept glancing toward the door, his eyes darting nervously as if expecting someone, or something, to burst in at any moment. Unable to bear the tension any longer, I finally blurted out, "Something's wrong." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken fears. Mr. Smith froze, his fork clattering to his plate, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. Time seemed to stop, the room holding its breath. He looked at me, his eyes wide with fear and desperation, revealing a depth of emotion I hadn't seen before. "I have to tell you something," he whispered, his voice hoarse, trembling. "Something important." The urgency in his tone sent a shiver down my spine. His confession was a torrent of guilt and dread. "My name isn't really Mr. Smith," he said, his voice quaking. "I'm living under an assumed identity. I'm a fugitive, running from a past I can't escape." Shock coursed through me, his words flipping my perception of him upside down. He spoke of a crime, a moment of desperation that spiraled into a life of fear and isolation. As he recounted the events that led him to this point, his voice trembled, revealing the weight of his secret. I listened, stunned, as he described a life filled with dread, the paralyzing fear of being caught. His orderly existence was a prison, a facade hiding a truth I never suspected. I can't keep this to myself any longer, he confessed, his chest heaving as he struggled to control his emotions. I've hurt someone. I made a terrible mistake. My heart raced, the room feeling smaller as the walls closed in around me. I wanted to believe he was just a kind neighbor, but his words twisted the knife of doubt deeper into my gut. "What did you do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He leaned in, the intensity of his gaze locking onto mine. "I didn't mean to hurt them. It was an accident. But they're gone now. I had to leave. I've been running ever since." A part of me wanted to flee, to leave his home and never look back. But another part of me, the part that had found solace in his company, wanted to comfort him. "Is that why you're so anxious? Are you in danger?" "Yes," he breathed, running a hand through his hair, his face a mask of torment. "They're looking for me. I thought I could start fresh here, but I can't escape my past." My mind raced, grappling with the implications of his confession. I had let my guard down, opened my home to a man who might be dangerous. The realization sent a jolt of fear through me. "What do you want from me?" I stammered. His expression shifted, a glimmer of desperation flickering in his eyes. "I need your help. I can't do this alone. If they find me—" Before he could finish, a loud bang echoed from the front door, jolting us both. Mr. Smith's face drained of color, his anxiety morphing into sheer panic. He jumped up, his chair scraping against the floor as he rushed toward the door, peeking through the window. "Who is it?" I whispered, dread pooling in my stomach. "I don't know," he hissed, his eyes wide with terror. "They can't find me here." My instinct screamed at me to leave, to run from this man who had become a stranger in the blink of an eye. I slipped quietly to the back of the house, heart racing. The weight of his secret pressed down on me, and I could feel the walls closing in. Just as I reached the kitchen, the front door burst open, crashing against the wall with a deafening thud. Footsteps thundered through the house. Mr. Smith's voice trembled as he shouted, "You can't come in! I'm not here!" I glanced over my shoulder, my heart in my throat. The shadows shifted in the hallway, figures emerging with cold determination. "We know you're in there, Smith. Come out with your hands up." Panic surged through me. I turned, heart pounding, ready to make my escape. But as I reached for the door, I froze. Mr. Smith was standing in the doorway, his expression twisted with fear. "Please," he begged, eyes pleading, "don't leave me. I need you." The pounding on the door grew louder, and I realized I was caught in a nightmare, teetering on the edge of a decision that could cost me everything. Trusting him could mean my end, but turning away felt like a betrayal. In that moment, I understood the true darkness lurking behind the smile of the man I once thought I knew. "Help me!" he cried, his voice cracking. With the sounds of his past closing in around us, I stood frozen between the shadows of my fears and the haunting question of loyalty. In the stillness, one truth loomed large. Sometimes the faces we trust hide the darkest secrets.